Hello, everybody, whether you're here with us live or whether you're tuning in later on YouTube. Good to have you. Yes, I was going to say I graduated. I retired 5 years ago and actually moved back to Montana, where my wife and I had lived before, and spent many summers, and we now live there. Although at the moment I'm actually in Maine. Our older daughter lives here with our beautiful little grandbaby. So we're here helping out with the grandkid this week. So, but it's beautiful and sunny, if I'm sure somewhat chillier than it is in San Diego at the moment. But anyway, thanks for tuning in. Right, I've been asked to talk about movement training and about disability in performance, in theater performance. So I'm going to start out talking about movement training first of all, and then we'll get to the issues around disability later. Just briefly, how does somebody end up in this field as a movement teacher? And I'll explain in just a minute what a movement teacher actually does. But for me, I was a very physical kid, and I played sports. I played basketball. I played volleyball. Both of them I played in high school. I was in the outdoors a lot. I helped out in the summers on my grandparents' ranch in Texas, and I just was sort of constantly physically active. And I think that helped send me in the direction of physical performance, because I was also active. My mother got me involved in theater as a kid, and community theater and youth theater. And in the late 60s and early 70s, mime and clowning and the sort of physical forms of theater, which were known at the time by some people as the new vaudeville, were very interesting to me. And I became involved. I pursued that sort of thing through college, studied in San Francisco during that time and after college, and began touring really quite soon after I graduated from college with a couple of different companies, one of whom was led by my main teacher and mentor, James Donlin, who I studied with in San Francisco and who later taught at UC Santa Barbara for many years. So I did a lot of touring of that very physical kind of material. I went to graduate school, studied acting, learned a lot more about acting. And it was really at that time that I began to sort of put together the idea of teaching actors from a physical standpoint. In the first couple of early teaching jobs I had, I sort of assembled my own approach to this kind of teaching. And I think right now what I should do is back up just a little bit and explain a little bit about how movement teaching even came to be in professional actor training programs. If you go all the way back to the Greek theater, really the beginnings of Western theater, actors taught each other. Younger actors learned from the older actors. This continued all the way through Shakespeare's time, Moliere's time, really up to the 19th century, and really actually continues today. Actors still learn from other actors. But you can imagine in Shakespeare's time, younger actors sitting backstage and watching the older actors ply their trade, talking to them after the show, before the show, learning their tricks, learning their ideas, their techniques. That's the way actors always learned. Beginning in the 19th century, though, in Europe, there was a move towards established conservatories for actors. Music conservatories had existed for a long time, but conservatories came into being. Sarah Bernhardt, the great French actress, studied at a conservatory in Paris. But in the United States, that kind of training never really came around, not during that period of time anyway. In the United States, there really was no formal training for actors until really the post-war period. There were a couple of universities before World War II who had theater departments, Carnegie Mellon, Northwestern, eventually UCLA had a big department, not in that sort of same period of time, but there wasn't that much theater training in universities. After World War II, the most serious actor training took place in private studios, and most people have heard of the Actors Studio, which was run by its major teacher, Lee Strasberg, who had been very influenced by the Moscow Theater and Russian theater. And in this period of time, say from the late 40s to the early 60s, when the studio system was really the major way serious actors were trained, and there were many studios besides the Actors Studio, some of them run by proteges of Strasberg. Those studios were really oriented towards teaching students about what they needed to learn for the theater and the movie industry at the time. The major playwrights of the time, like Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams, were doing plays that were realistic in nature. And of course, the film business was making movies that with every decade became more and more based in realism. So the sort of personalized, emotionally oriented teaching that Lee Strasberg and others engaged in at that time was meant to teach actors how to function within the context of realism. In the 60s, as you know, lots of things changed all over our culture and everywhere else. And there began to be a movement that was more varied in nature. A lot of nonprofit regional theaters were popping up all over the country, theaters not unlike, well, like the Old Globe and others like it. And so Shakespeare, Moliere, the Greek playwrights were being performed more often by companies by acting companies where actors would play a number of different roles in a season. There were also an emergence of new American playwrights like Sam Shepard and Amiri Baraka, Maria Irene Fornes, who were doing plays that were not really rooted in realism, and they were much more theatrical and ripe for a lot of physical performance. So with the transformation in the theater in particular, there was a need really to engage in a more broad-based, I guess I would just say more full kind of actor training. It was also during that period of time that universities began doing more actor training. In particular, there were Master of Fine Arts programs, graduate programs in the theater that were popping up all over the country, really sort of parallel to the expansion of regional theaters. And it became sort of the duty of those MFA programs to train people for a more challenging environment for actors. And the thinking was, amongst the people who started all those MFA programs, some of them influenced, by the way, by European teachers such as Michel Saint-Denis, they began to think that acting needed three primary things. One, you needed acting teachers. That's always existed in acting conservatories or whatever. But you couldn't just have one acting teacher like you might have at the Actors Studio. You'd have an acting teacher who taught the classics, Shakespeare and other classical playwrights, somebody who did teach realism, and perhaps one thing that's always been taught in realism are the plays of Anton Chekhov. And then maybe a third acting teacher who, say, taught the absurdists like Beckett and Ionesco. So you had this real variety of acting teachers. Then you needed a voice teacher, and possibly, if your program could swing it, a voice and a speech teacher. We were very lucky here at UCSD to have both of those for many years. Our speech teacher, Eva Barnes, I think did a lecture for the Retirement Association last year. And then the third area was movement. Now, movement you might be thinking about dance when you think of movement, and certainly dance training was the kind of physical training that actors got in earlier years. Even at the Actors Studio, they did encourage the actors to take dance class, ballet, modern dance, tap dance, all those kinds of things that might be useful. And dance is, in fact, very important, I think, for actors to study. But really, the thinking was that the needs of actors were sort of more specific than what they could learn in dance training. So I think now at this point in history, in the history of actor training, there are many, many, many approaches to movement training. There are people who focus on what is now being mostly referred to as the somatic, the thinking about movement, and the perception of one's own movement and understanding of sort of from an internal basis. But there are acting or movement teachers who teach stage combat. There are movement teachers who teach solely mask work with masks. And I think, let me tell you a little bit about the process that I've come to in teaching movement. There are three main pillars, you might say, of my teaching a movement, which pillars makes it sound really grand, but it seems like the best way to describe it. The first is physical awareness and body knowledge. As everybody recognizes, I think, when you leave your childhood and move into adolescence and adulthood, your movement expression becomes diminished, reduced, by social forces, by your own psychology, whatever it is. But you're not moving as freely and expressively as you used to. And here in Maine for this week, taking care of our little granddaughter, who's just a little shy of 3 years old, you go, oh my gosh, look at that. That's somebody who has no inhibitions, nothing to limit the way they express themselves or move. And while the aim is not to get people to return to their childlike movement, the aim is to have people sort of access their body, to re-enliven their body, to understand what they're communicating when they're communicating, and to communicate fully. That, as you can imagine, is a pretty big project when you're getting students who are into their 20s and maybe even 30 years old in programs like ours, graduate programs like ours. That's a real process. But when you are sitting as an audience member in the theater and you watch somebody walk on stage, you are immediately, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, you are reading what they are communicating. So actors need to know what their body is doing and how to focus it in the right way. And this is a big project of the first year of training. The second important area for me, is particularly in the first year of training, is creativity and the imagination. This, I think, can't be underestimated as an important aspect. The actors have to do a lot of analysis. They have to do a lot of looking into history, social conditions, all those things that are part of the context of a play that they're looking at. It's actually in many ways a very heady process. And they are, of course, particularly if you're doing the classics, very focused on the verbal aspects of things. But I think that's not really where you're going to learn creativity. I think creativity is really best learned physically and non-verbally. And I'm interested in, again, people, to use a cliche, thinking outside the box. And or perhaps, as I think another way to put it, for actors who are interested in expanding their creative flow, as it were, is not thinking to get out of the box. To some extent, the focusing on the physical helps you respond impulsively in a physical way. And that alone helps you expand the way you see the world, the way you perceive things, all of that. So creativity is really important. And then the third area is a focus is how we put these two back together. And how do we integrate it with acting, with all that, the analytical processes that are important to actors? How do we fuse that with the creative and with the fully physically aware? And that's something that I do in the sort of latter part of training, the second and third year. And that's obviously really the goal. For me, in the second year, I teach mostly mask work, but also a kind of physicalized storytelling that actually uses language and focuses heavily on physical technique, on clarity, on precision, on those kinds of things. We want to build that into the actor's body. Athleticism, sense of dynamics, all of that needs to be present for actors. Let me give you just a couple of examples of what I might be doing in the studio when we're in class. I couldn't possibly tell you everything we do because it's a lot of material that covers 2.5 years. But one of the things that Stanislavski, the great Russian director from the Moscow Art Theater, believed was that actors needed to be fearless. And he was talking about physical fearlessness, really. And so I've always done a lot of tumbling with students. And that, is kind of scary for some people. Some of it's just basic tumbling, but it's also basic acrobatics, back handsprings, standing back flips, standing on other people's shoulders, and of course, supporting people on your shoulders. I'm not going to claim that all my actors come out being able to graduate, being able to do a standing backflip. That's not necessarily even the goal. There are some that do. There are some in every class that are able to confidently pull off a pretty scary acrobatic feat like that. But really, it's the process of learning how to do that, the challenge of doing that. And we have, a lot of spotting techniques so that people never get hurt. But you can imagine the leap of faith it takes to do a back handspring, to jump backwards and up and over, upside down, land on your hands, and then snap your legs back down. That's a challenge that is pretty hard to meet. But even when you're spotting people who are never quite able to do it without a spotter, even when they're spotted, people are amazed that they can do this. And this is one of the things we want people to believe about themselves, is that they can do it. You tell somebody to run and jump over that thing, yes, I think I can do that. You want to make sure that there are a lot of safety protocols in place so that people don't get hurt. And I myself had a pretty great safety record, I have to say. I've never had people hurt doing anything that was dangerous. But people gain a lot of confidence doing that sort of thing. So tumbling is one big thing. Another exercise that I do throughout the entire 2 years of intensive classes that I had with people. Usually I taught in the third year, but not as many hours, not as intensively. This exercise is called the neutral sequence. And dealing with neutral physicality is actually a common thing amongst movement teachers. I wouldn't be surprising to me if actually most teachers at some point deal in the idea of neutrality with their students. And this is the idea that you should be able to release yourself from your own idiosyncrasies and stand or walk or sit or lay without the little there's one movement teacher who referred to it as to them as parasites. That is the attributes that you have. I think that's kind of a negative word, but I think of them more as idiosyncrasies or indications of your internal life or your emotional life, your psychological life. We want to see if we can get rid of that. Not permanently. I've never believed that we were trying to radically change people's bodies. But what they do need to have is the ability to let go of that stuff, so that those attributes that they have are they're not tied to them. They're not present in a way that is distracting from the behavior of a character that they're engaging in. This is really an exercise in focus and concentration and sort of an internal understanding of what your body looks like, what your body should feel like when it's well placed. It's a rigorous, kind of passive but rigorous exercise, challenging. And it's amazing how far you can see people grow in 2 years of doing that on a regular basis. And my former students will all say that that's was a hugely valuable exercise for them to do during that time. I also use on the creativity front a lot of visual arts, a lot of music in order to inspire pieces that we do in class. I think that modern abstract art throws a loop at a lot of people, and having to engage with it creatively and make something out of the ideas that they might see presented in a piece of art is really valuable, and we get a lot of mileage out of that. The other really important part of movement teaching with graduate students, or any students who are working intensively to be actors, for the movement coach, is to be present in rehearsal and serve as a movement coach or movement advisor during rehearsal, so that you have a way to integrate what we're teaching in class with roles that people are playing in rehearsal. So I spent a lot of time in rehearsal working with actors to get to where they want to get physically with a particular character. I'll have 2 anecdotes about that, so you understand what I'm talking about. We had an actor at UCSD who was playing a 15-year-old boy. So this is a 25-year-old guy who's quite fit and athletic, not super buff kind of guy, but certainly very fit, and certainly 25 years old. He was playing a 15-year-old boy, and one of his classmates was playing his probably 40-something-year-old father in this play. The other actor was taller and sort of broader. So, this happens in training, that you have those kinds of disparities, departures, I guess, from what the roles are supposed to be. But we had to make a distinction between these 2 people. And the actor playing the younger role, was struggling a bit with having to figure out how to play 15 without being over the top, without doing some kind of caricature. And what we came to was, I just had him, I'm going to lift up a little bit so you can see, and pointing to the very middle of my chest, my sternum, really. And what we had him do is just contract that a little bit, just let that his chest cave in just a little bit, not a lot. And he was costumed with a t-shirt, so you could see that contraction. And I think for the viewer, that made a big difference. It lowered his status level. It made him look weaker and just smaller. And that's very important. But probably what's even more important was how it makes the actor feel physically. You know that if you change your physicality in some way or another, it makes you feel a different way. If you sit in the corner all day curled up in a ball, that's going to make you feel differently than if you're walking outside and looking at the sky and you're open and all of that. That the physical really translates into how you think, how you are thinking about yourself. So it made a difference to the actor. Another example of this, I've done a lot of movement coaching for theater companies, professional theater companies, and I did a number of shows at the Playhouse, La Jolla Playhouse, when Des McAnuff was there. And we were working on the production of Zhivago, which you may have seen. That was 15 or 16 years ago. And at the last minute, one of the lead actors lost his voice singing. He blew his voice out, couldn't sing, couldn't speak, and had to leave the production. And they brought in an actor, a really good actor named Matt Bogart, who had, I think, I had known him before. I think he must have done other shows with the Playhouse before. And he was not in the original cast, but he was in the cast of Jersey Boys for quite a while on Broadway. And when he came in, he had a week to learn all the staging, to learn all the songs, to learn the whole part, to learn all about the character. And he, in talking with him, he was clear that he learned more than anything by exploring and doing things physically. So they were really good. The director and the stage manager, the production team gave he and I some pretty good chunks of time, like an hour or so every day for 2 or 3 days. It doesn't sound like that much time, but when you're getting down to the opening of a show, that's actually quite a bit of time just to work on the physicality. So we went through every single scene in his play and figured out what the physical reality of that scene was for this character. And really, that's the way Matt learned that entire show, was by understanding it physically. And it was a great example, really, of the value of a movement coach. Any movement coach could have done that with him, and it would have made a huge difference. I just want to say, before I switch to talking about disability, we were talking about backflips a second ago, and perhaps my favorite moment of all time of any show I ever directed was Sam Shepard's Fool for Love. And there's a scene in that where the main character is supposed to do a standing backflip. And the actor who played that role in a production I did in Los Angeles was a former student of mine. And he was wearing full shirt, long sleeve shirt, jeans, and cowboy boots, and every night did a standing backflip. It was, I loved it. I don't know if everybody else loved it as much as I did, but it's a fantastic moment. Anyway, maybe the highlight of my movement coaching career. Okay, I want to talk a bit about disability here for the latter section of things here. Our program at UCSD has always been a very ethnically, racially diverse program. We've been very fortunate that way. But in 2010, I was doing auditions around the country with my colleague, Kyle Donnelly. She was head of the actor training program for many years. And we always did auditions in New York and Chicago and San Francisco and in San Diego. And in Chicago, we're sitting there at the table and you see a lot of people, but suddenly here comes somebody through the door in a wheelchair, which was probably the first time in years of doing auditions that I had ever had anybody come through the door in a wheelchair. And this student was Reagan Linton. And she did an audition that was really quite good. And she left the room, and Kyle and I looked at each other and thought, that's interesting. And we called her back later and we talked to her. We found out a bit about her. She had been in a terrible car accident when she was 20 and was paralyzed from the middle of her chest down. And when we saw her, she was by that time in her late 20s. She had recovered and rehabilitated and was quite proficient with a wheelchair. I have to say, she could do all kinds of cool things. And so we took her into the program, and this sort of started something for us. And actually, we were really the first major MFA program to take in somebody with a serious disability like that. And I have to say, we've got the ball rolling nationally, and Reagan has become a kind of a national spokeswoman for actors with disabilities. But I have to say, for me, it led to quite a long period of learning, really, from Reagan. she and I talked quite a bit before the school year started, and so I had some ideas about how to accommodate her. And we started into the quarter, and about halfway through the quarter, she came to my office and she said, Charlie, you're not really accommodating me. Probably a third or half the time. Actually, I don't remember what percentage she said, but it was big. I'm just watching. I can't. You haven't given me any way to get into this material that I can do from my wheelchair. And I was, kind of crestfallen, but she was right, totally right. And I was conscious at the time, but not really reacting enough to the fact that she wasn't 100% involved. So this began a dialogue between she and I, where I really began attempting anyway to make an accommodation for every single thing we did, and not leaving it up to her to find a way to do it. I mean, this sounds silly, like I should have been doing that from the beginning, but I kind of thought I was, but it took her pointing it out to me that I wasn't really, not to the extent that I needed to be. But it's led to a period of time, to 2 years of working with her in class all the time, where she did she was able to engage in the material in pretty much the same way as everybody else. Not in the same way, of course, she was in a wheelchair, but to the same extent. We had this neutral sequence that I talked about. We had to figure out, okay, what is neutral if you're sitting in a wheelchair? Neutral for actors without a disability is standing in good alignment with your arms at your side and your shoulders open, your chest open, all of that. What is it to be neutral when you are in a wheelchair? Or the next year, when we took in an actor with who's born with cerebral palsy, that's a different kind of body too. He was quite athletic, actually, but if you look at him doing the neutral sequence, it didn't look like everybody else. So what is the nature of that kind of expression? How do we read those bodies? Do we need to read them differently? Do we need to think of them differently, or do we just forge ahead with them and assume that there is a way to read their body in the same way that we read everybody else's body? It's a complicated question, but we did make a lot of headway, I have to say. And Reagan has gone on to have a really successful career as an actor, and I'll get back to that in a second, but I wanted to tell you about another actor that I worked with in a training situation, and that's after I retired, just before the pandemic. I get hired every now and then to teach at the University of Montana, where I live in Missoula. And so they had me over there to teach 2 classes for their MFA students, 8 actors and directors. And one of the students, Reggie Herbert, really great guy and a really good actor, was pretty seriously visually impaired. He has retinitis pigmentosus, where the periphery goes away. And I talked, just like with Reagan, I talked to Reggie before the course started to figure out what he could do. As I mentioned, I used a lot of visual materials. How was that going to work? How could we make it work for him? And I later was having a conversation with Reagan and said, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to teach this class without compromising the class for the rest of the students. And Reagan went off on what can best be described as a sort of angry rant, which, to sort of capsulize it, she said, we've been having to adjust for you people for a long time, and it's about time that you start to adjust to us. That's the basis of what she said, although I'm not using all the profanity she included too. Not something she's usually want to do, but she was passionate about this subject. So I rethought what I was going to do in that class and really just oriented everything that I did towards somebody who was visually impaired. And in fact, it it was very successful. The challenges were, even with sort of reimagined versions of these exercises, the challenges still worked for everyone in the class. Everybody went away with something valuable for them as individuals, and everybody was challenged. There was a lot that I would normally have done that I didn't do because it just would not have worked for Reggie. But I understood after doing that a course that was oriented towards a disabled person could work for everybody. Again, maybe you're thinking, well, that seems obvious, but after a lot of years of being a movement teacher, it wasn't obvious to me. The last thing I wanted to mention was that going back to Reagan Linton again, after some time as an actress in Los Angeles, she had a year-long contract at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and then she returned to Denver, where she was from, to become artistic director of this group, the Family Theater Company, which is a company of actors with disabilities. Been around a long time, and Reagan had worked with them after her serious injury and before she came back to school with us. And she wanted this company to succeed, and they had been going through some changes in leadership, things like that. So she took over, and she commissioned a project for me to develop with them, which was a piece about the intersection of art and disability. I worked with 7 older members of the company to create a script. Basically, what we did is we looked at artists like Beethoven, Frida Kahlo, Sarah Bernhardt, and Stevie Wonder, all really important artists who had disabilities. And then we sort of fused their stories with the stories of these actors, and put together this piece. We then had to audition a separate group of actors to actually perform the piece. The actors who created it were people who, either because of their age or the kind of disability they couldn't tour. They were offered the opportunity, but they all declined, because getting up at 7 a.m, getting yourself ready, get into the van, go do a performance, come back, or maybe go someplace else, spend the night in a motel, repeat the same thing the next day. That's just too much for the nature of the disability that these folks were dealing with. So we had actually, with one exception, one of those original actors was in the show. He's in his late 50s. The other actors were all quite a bit younger. And a little bit able to withstand that kind of touring schedule, which is, rigorous for anybody, whether you have a disability or not. And I loved working with these actors. It was really one of the most satisfying directing experiences I've ever had. And the reason is that these actors were completely without self-pity, were not sentimental, were not precious about what they did. They were very clear. They had a sense of humor about themselves and even their disabilities. And they were just frank. For example, at the beginning of rehearsal, the first week or so, I was staging a scene, and I had these 2 guys standing there for a while. And after a while, one of them, said, "Charlie, I'm not going to be able to stand this long. This is just not possible for me." And I said, "Okay, yeah, that's fine. We'll figure out a way to get you seated for a while." And that was such a breath of fresh air. A lot of times when you're working with actors in professional theater, and there's the pressure of that, sometimes it can be hard to know what actors are thinking, and you might get a vibe that maybe they're not 100% happy about what you're doing. But you just have to figure a way to deal with it and go on. It wasn't like that with these actors. These actors were extremely clear about who they are, what their bodies look like, and how they are read, and clear about what they needed. And they were very passionate about this piece because they felt that this piece actually explained, in a sense, a lot of what their lives are like and why they do what they do as actors and artists, and how disability is a sort of integral part of that. So that was very satisfying to me. And I recently was in New York and I saw Reagan. She was the understudy for the lead role in a new play called The Cost of Living, which unfortunately just closed, I found out, texting with her the other day. But it was a Broadway show that had 4 characters, 2 of whom had disabilities. And both of those actors were actors who have those disabilities, were cast in those roles. This is a big change, a big accomplishment. Some of you may remember the television show Glee that had a character who was in a wheelchair, but the actor was not in a wheelchair. Many of you might remember the movie My Left Foot, great movie, with Daniel Day-Lewis. We played a guy with a severe disability, but of course Daniel Day-Lewis doesn't have a disability. And for quite a long time, actors with disabilities have been, lobbying, trying to shake things up so that they could actually play the roles that are written for them. And here's a Broadway show where that actually happened. And Reagan was not cast in that lead part, but she did have a major. She was the understudy for that part, and that's a lot of really good work actually for any actor. So it's satisfying to see that sort of thing happen. If any of you are interested in reading more about the sort of theory side of things when it comes to disability, you might want to check out our UCSD colleague, Michael Davidson. Became very interested in the subject of disability in the last few years, and his book, Concerto for the Left Hand, goes into this sort of thing, the way we read disability and all that. It goes into that in quite some depth. So I might recommend that. Okay, that's what I've got to say. Suzanne, tell me what to do.
Charlie, what a fabulous presentation. Really interesting. And for me, something completely new. I'm sure for many of our listeners as well. I know I have a couple of questions, but I'd certainly like to open it up to members. If any of you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand electronically. Let me just kick off to the beginning part of your presentation. When you were talking about in your youth, you got some experience as a mime. How did your mime experience translate or help with your movement experience later on?
Yeah, it was really the beginning of it. I mean, it was the idea that theater could be about physicality. When I was a kid, I saw a couple different times. I saw Marcel Marceau, great French mime. And I found that to be kind of magical, really, and influential. I never in my life wore that white face that Marcel did, but I was inspired that way. I think it in terms of, I actually teach, without even really calling it that, I teach a lot of mime as I'm teaching movement performance. If you're talking about sort of physical storytelling, there's a certain amount of mime that just has to be there. It just comes up. And it's also very much a part of being precise and exact with what you do, because mime illusion is a very exacting kind of thing. So it actually played a pretty big role without really me ever identifying it all that much with my students. Yeah.
And furthermore, some of the training that you were doing, the tumbling training, were you ever referring students out to say, go take a tumbling class, or it was all what you were doing in class?
If people, I did know where to refer people. At UCSD, there was a regular gymnastics class, taught at REMAC. And so when people showed a big interest and wanted to go further than what we were going to be able to do in class, yes, absolutely. And not just for acrobatics or gymnastics, with dance, with more advanced yoga. We had a yoga teacher every morning, but some people wanted more, of course. So yeah, I kind of had a little bit of the pulse on all the physical forms that were around. that people could get more training in, and definitely referred it to. Unfortunately, MFA acting students don't have a whole lot of extra time in their day. They're sort of busy from 9 in the morning till about 10:30 at night. But some people were able to pursue things a little bit further. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Vanya, go ahead.
Hello, Professor Oates. So I joined a bit late. Apologies if I might have missed this question. We did have Reagan actually join us for a student panel recently, and I agree, she's wonderful. And so she talked a bit about invisible disabilities as well. So I was wondering, what kind of accommodations do you see in your field for these kind of less visible disabilities per se, that you can't see apparently right away? Could you speak a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, I'm not going to claim to be an expert on that, but I'll say that in this production that we did with Family, with Reagan's company, there were 2 actors in that show who had what I believe would be referred to as invisible disabilities. One had this thing called Fragile X syndrome, which I had never heard of before, which has a few aspects to it, but it is related to autism. And another younger actor had what she described as a severe social disability. And I don't really know if there must be particular ways to approach these kind of disabilities in the setting that I'm most familiar with, in a rehearsal setting or a classroom setting. But I guess I was just patient and empathetic. I mean, I think that's really the main thing we need to have. I mean, certainly as teachers of any kind, empathy is huge, and you need to create an environment where people are willing, again, to say what they need, or willing to make it okay if somebody just melts into a puddles and cries for a while. I think that kind of empathy is important, especially if it's as you're describing, an invisible disability where you may not really have any idea what's going on at all. If people have adapted and have figured out ways to cope or to hide it or whatever, I think you just have to be patient and empathetic.
Thank you.
Other questions from members? Seeing none right now, I'll jump in with one more, and that is, you did mention that Reagan was part of a Shakespeare festival. Did you ever see sort of someone in a wheelchair, Reagan or other, get into some of the roles that one would never expect a handicapped person to be in, say Romeo and Juliet, the role of Juliet, or are there just barriers that we could never go there?
I think that's a really good question, and I think that there have been more and more examples of theater companies attempting to do that, of putting people with very visible disabilities into roles like that. I saw Reagan in the 2 shows that she was in at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and in one of them she played Don John in Much Ado About Nothing, who's kind of it's an interesting part to put a person with a disability in when you don't have very many people with disabilities in your company, because he's the villain in that play. And I think if Reagan were here, I shouldn't put words in her mouth, but I'm guessing that she thought that was actually a good thing, because we have a way to sort of, I don't know what the right word would be, say, look at disabled people as being innocent and precious and kind of above reproach in a way. I think that is kind of a way a lot of people in society look at disability, and there's a sort of sympathy, right? So to have a person in a wheelchair play the villain of the play, I think in a way was a step forward in that world. and she was great in that part. She was mean and nasty and scary in a way, and that was great. It was great to see her in a part like that. Any disabled person in a part like that, and it's also true with this play, The Cost of Living. The two people in this Broadway show who are disabled, they are like every other person. They are people with faults and all kinds of maybe not so pleasant attributes in their lives.
Thank you. Joel, go ahead.
So thank you. This was intriguing. We've all weathered another political season, and listening to you made me wonder about physical body coaching of politicians. Is that a career option for you should you decide to get out of what you're doing?
That's really interesting. I've thought many times, oh my gosh, if they could just give me 15 minutes with that person. I have thought about that, but it's very common to have vocal coaches and speech coaches, as you would imagine, for political candidates. But it's an interesting thing. This isn't necessarily a candidate, but it's kind of related. One example that I've given a lot in my class is, what is the role of a president to the country, particularly say at a time of a disaster? And I was thinking back to George W. Bush after 9/11, and him standing at the podium, and if you just take away everything that he might have said, which I think, a lot of what he would have said would have been what most presidents would have said, but he's standing there in this very neutral way. He's standing there not in a way that gives away anything internal. He's got the suit on. Of course, suits are cut in a way that doesn't allow for idiosyncrasy, really. And that in a way, at a moment like that, it's actually kind of good to have that lack of physical idiosyncrasy or disturbance or whatever. But that's one example where that comes to mind. But I think for candidates, I don't know. I'm not actually sure in some ways that I want to, because I think you want to get the person you want to get. You know what I mean? You want to see who you're getting. And I don't want to say that actors are dishonest by being able to transform. You could say that they actually have a high level of honesty, but
And you certainly wouldn't want to say that politicians are dishonest.
I wouldn't want to say that. I wouldn't want to make, I guess what I'm saying is I wouldn't want to make them more dishonest by cleaning up their physicality. I say, let the cards fall where they may with politicians. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Joel. Charlie, I know you are familiar with the fact that we run the Chancellor Scholars Program. And for myself personally, I was very heavily involved in theater in high school and college. It wasn't my major in college, but I was just really active in it. And I really credit it for my comfort in presenting to people and directing things and just being a sort of upfront, outward-facing kind of person. Would you recommend for all of our Chancellor Scholars that they should all be taking at least one theater class?
I think it could serve a lot of them really well. Our department has a intro to acting class, which is supervised, by a faculty member, but taught also by graduate students. The undergraduates who take that class love that class, and I just have to think, knowing the material that they do, that they, especially those who have not been exposed to that sort of thing, come out slightly different at the end of that. You know what I mean? I really do, and it's a very popular class. It fulfills a GE requirement, and so it fills up every quarter, but I think it's so much about what I was talking about freedom of expression and about being loose and responding openly to people and all of that. And yeah, I think it's really valuable.
Is there a movement component to that class?
I would say that it's pretty physical in nature. Yeah, not in a sort of maybe a more technical way that I would teach movement, but certainly it's your students are up on their feet and active throughout most of the class every day. Yeah, every